Hello, my name is Julian Horton. I'm President of the Society for Music Analysis and also Professor of Music at Durham University. The subject of my talk is music analysis and various techniques of music analysis, but it specifically concerns how the discipline of analysis relates to music history and musicology. The disciplines of analysis and musicology have sometimes been seen to be in conflict, in tension somehow, or at least opposed or complementary maybe, because music analysis very often looks at music out of its historical context. It looks at the score as we have it now, whereas musicology looks at music in its historical context, in its cultural context, and takes account of the context of the piece. But what I want to do today is look at ways in which analysis and history can work together, because I think sometimes it's the case that analysis needs history. Self-evidently, any piece of music that the analyst looks at is an historical artifact as well. But also I think history needs analysis, because a lot of the evidence that history requires in order to make assertions about music in context is analytical and needs to engage with the material, needs to engage with the score in a variety of ways. So I'm going to look at a case study of how analysis and history can converse or work in partnership. The way I'm going to do this is by focusing on one piece of music, one example, which I think is particularly clear and which relates its historical and analytical features very clearly. And this piece is Brahms' First Symphony, and specifically the first movement, which is very, very rich in the analytical detail that you can extract from it, but also has a very complex and also tangible historical context to draw on. And these two things relate very nicely together, I think. I'm going to go about this by looking at 4 moments in this movement. I'll play each of those moments and draw out analytical evidence as I go along. When I've done that, I'm going to start then linking the analytical evidence to a broader historical context. Before turning to the first instance, I want to say just a little bit about the context of the piece. This piece was composed between 1862 and 1876, 1877. So it has a very, very long genesis. It caused Brahms a great deal of trouble compositionally, and other works are written around the process. So between 1862 and 1876, other major works come into being, primarily the German Requiem, the Opus 51 string quartets, and to an extent they all feed into the process that eventually produces the First Symphony. At the same time, there is a heated political context for this piece, because the politics of the symphony in Vienna at the time of composition are closely bound up with not only political but aesthetic arguments about what a symphony should be. And this connects to the arguments between the so-called progressive New German school on the one hand, as signified by Liszt, Wagner, and in some estimations Bruckner. And on the other hand, what is seen as a more conservative alternative, which is the so-called romantic classicists, for which Brahms becomes a major figure, but which might be said to track back through Schumann and Mendelssohn. So here then is the main theme, the first subject group, in the first movement of Brahms' First Symphony. Here's the introduction. And the first presentation of the material. Reaching cadence. Then the second presentation. Reaching its cadence. So let's dissect what you've just heard a little bit. So the opening material, the introduction, consists of 2 elements. The first element is the little ascending chromatic figure, like that, which is partnered with a turn figure in response, like so, and then that's answered by another version of that in the violins, like so. And the whole thing together sounds like this. So that then provides all the material for what comes next. The chromatic figure is then transferred into the cellos, into the bass voice, and that becomes this theme. And against that, Brahms sets a new idea, which is in counterpoint with that, which sounds like this. So we can split that up. We can talk about the cello voice as comprising the two elements, and so let's call them C and D, and above them the two elements, let's call that A and what Brahms then does is he takes these little elements, he spins them out and varies them so that new versions of them are constantly being created. But he also uses them in counterpoint and various combinations as we go along. Sometimes it's clear what the identity of the motive is, and sometimes Brahms conceals the identity, or he strips away elements of it. So, for example, my motive B, I was talking about a moment ago, then subsequently becomes this, which is essentially the intervallic frame of that motive with the interior taken out. Brahms also does all sorts of contrapuntal things to the motives. So, for example, in the second presentation within the main theme, the first thing he does is he takes the chromatic figure, which I call C, and he turns it upside down. So instead of, we have this, and then repeated. And then he takes the response to that, which I call D, and he turns that upside down and repeats it. Like that, and he follows that up with our motive C the right way round. Like so. And above that, there are extended variants of A and B as well. So here is A, then repeated, and then repeated again. Like so, followed by B. And then repeated. Like that. So all of this music is being spun out of these two tiny ideas. And actually that holds for the whole of the exposition of this movement. So I'm now going to turn to my second example, which is the second subject group, which is now in the relative major of E-flat major. Ostensibly, this is very, very different. It sounds much more lyrical and expressive, but the lyricism and the change of character conceals the fact that actually we've still got the same music. So here then is example 2. This is the end of the transition. And here's the start of the second subject. So this sounds expressively very different to the first subject group. It's much more lyrical, it's in the relative major. There's a change of expressive context. But this conceals the fact that, again, all of this material is spun out of this very, very small fund of motives. So, for example, the cellos have the melody here, which it transpires is just another version of our motive A, which sounds like this. Like that, and then that motive is picked up by the first violins. And they then carry forwards and partner it with B going into a cadence. When they do that, the bass takes up motive C, our little chromatic figure that's happening down here. Like that, but this time inverted. So the two together sound like this. Like so. And in fact, the start of the second subject is also a counterpoint of motive A and motive C, because when the cellos have this idea, the oboes have this, which is our motive C again. So the two together. And that carries on. The oboes then have C in sequence. And when we get to our cadence, and the violins have motive B, the basses partner it with yet another variant of motive C. So the two together like so. So this is really just another complex of contrapuntal relationships spun out of our basic fund of 4 motives, now treated in inversion and with the texture inverted as well, because at the start of the second subject the cellos have motive A, the winds have motive C. At the end of the second subject it's turned upside down. The violins have motive A, the basses have motive C. And this technique of generating what sounds like new material expressively and in terms of its character from this small fund of common motives is continued into the closing section of the exposition, which again sounds expressively very different from what you've just heard. It's in E-flat minor. It's returned to the pathos of the first subject. But what we're going to see is yet another process of generating new character from the same fund of 4 motives. So here now is the closing section of the exposition going up to its final closing cadence. Here's the statement. Here's the response. And finally, an expanded cadence. So again, this has a very different character from the second group. It's reverted back to the pathos of the first subject. And the material seems distinct. But once we look under its surface, we're going to see that, again, it's all derived from this fund of 4 small motives from the first subject. We have what seems like a new idea in the violins, like so. But really, that is just an elaboration of our motive C, the chromatic ascent, like that, with this new quaver prefix, like that. Set against that is again what seems like new material in the bass, but it's just an inversion of our motive A. So here is A from the first subject, and here is what happens in the bass here in the closing section, like that. And it continues with an inversion of motive B, like so. And those two things together make up the presentation of this material. And then in the response, Brahms uses a technique called invertible counterpoint. He takes what was in the violins in the statement and puts it in the bass, and he takes what was in the bass and puts it in the violins. So now the basses have, and the violins have, like so. So the voices swap around. And then he has another contrapuntal trick up his sleeve for the cadence as well, because the bass in the cadence takes this idea and inverts its intervals. It sets off like this, like that. in canon, that is to say, being imitated half a bar later by the violas and second violins, who are going like this, and so on. So this is a dense web of contrapuntal relations. And that's true of the whole exposition, which is really about spinning out motivic variation in counterpoint. You can look at the whole thing as a web of contrapuntal working out of this initial fund of motives. And you'd expect that to continue into the development section, because developments, after all, are traditionally contrapuntally and thematically developmental out of the exposition. But Brahms does something surprising. Instead of further pursuing the motivic implications of his exposition material, he stalls a developmental process around the closing section, and instead a chorale melody comes in, which seems to be new material, which sounds like this. And what that in fact is a quotation. It's a chorale taken from the end of the Storm movement of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, which sounds like this. At the same time, Brahms also introduces a second quotation from Beethoven, which is much more obvious, and that's what happens in the winds here, who simultaneously go like this. Which, of course, is the opening motive of the Fifth Symphony. So now I'll play you that example as example 4. So here is build up into the closing section material. But here instead is the Beethoven chorale. Back to the closing section. And the chorale again. But now modulating. Still the chorale, and you can still hear the Fifth Symphony. And then he breaks out of the chorale. So the question of why Brahms should quote Beethoven here brings us back to the historical issues that I raised at the start. Because a quotation from Beethoven is not just a purely musical reference, it's also aligning Brahms with a certain notion of what a symphony should be. In effect, the quotation says, this is a legitimate post-Beethovenian symphony. I establish this piece sort of as an heir to the Beethoven model. And that agenda brings with it a whole political argument which is current in Vienna in the late 19th century, because it turns out that Brahms's idea of the symphony is only one idea of the symphony, and there is another one which stands on the opposite side of the political spectrum. And this circulates around Liszt and Wagner and the so-called New German School, whose championship of Bruckner advocated a very different kind of post-Beethovenian symphony. And there's a technical aspect to this as well, because it turns out that this contrapuntal motivic way of writing that we've just seen in Brahms's First Symphony was part of the political argument. It was a way of writing that was associated very much with chamber music, especially with the string quartet. And Brahms, of course, is the great advocate of chamber music in the late 19th century. And there were those on the political right, and who aligned with the New German School, who saw this as an inappropriate way of writing symphonies, not only because they thought that a chamber musical technique was inappropriate for a public, monumental genre like the symphony, but also because chamber music had a political orientation associated with it. It was very much associated with the bourgeois middle class, with the liberal intelligentsia in Vienna, with which Brahms was very closely aligned. And we can see this in contemporary critical writing. For example, if we look at the writings of Wagner in this time, because Wagner published an article in response to Brahms' First and Second Symphonies, called On the Application of Music to the Drama, in which he specifically critiques Brahms's use of this chamber musical technique. And he says the material is like little bits of chopped hay or dried grass that have no sort of substance. And a symphony needs to have full-blooded melody, not chamber musical, intellectual, contrapuntal working. So our technical analysis that we've just undertaken, this looking at motives and counterpoint, is not only telling us something about structure, about the score, about the music in the present, it's also, and more importantly, telling us something historical. It's telling us something about the historical context of Brahms's music, about the symphony in its time, and about the political arguments that surround that. So this then, I think, is the most compelling reason why we should encourage a dialogue between analysis and history. Because it turns out that no analysis of the 19th century symphony can do without history, but really no history of the 19th century symphony can do without analysis.